My parents changed the locks while I was at work and texted me to say my room belonged to my sister now. They told me to come get my trash off the lawn. I was 35 years old paying them $1,000 a month. I did not call them. I did not beg for them to let me inside. I drove straight to the courthouse instead. By Friday, a sheriff was at their door with papers that made them sick to their stomachs. I am Maya. I am 35 years old and a senior real estate auditor. I spend my days tracking down hidden assets, verifying property deeds, and dealing with ironclad laws. Perhaps that is why the betrayal from my own family felt less like a heartbreak and more like a massive miscalculation on their part. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The sky over Atlanta had opened up, pouring cold, relentless rain. I had just finished a grueling 10-hour shift closing a massive commercial escrow account. My tailored suit was damp, my feet ached in my heels, and all I wanted was a hot shower and a quiet evening. I pulled into the driveway of the colonial house in the suburbs. It was the house I had called home for the past 5 years. I walked up the concrete steps, shivering against the chill, and slid my key into the brass deadbolt. It did not turn. I jiggled it, thinking the old mechanism was just acting up again. Nothing happened. I pulled the key out, wiped the rain from my face, and tried again. It was a completely different lock. The shiny new metal mocked me under the porch light. Before I could even process what was happening, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a text message from my mother, Yvonne. I opened it, the screen blurring slightly from the raindrops. She wrote that my room was Chloe and Trent's now. She said Trent needed a proper space for his startup studio. She told me I was 35 years old and it was time I got out and lived on my own. Then she ordered me to come get my trash off the lawn before the homeowners association complained. I slowly lowered my phone and turned around. Through the sheets of rain, I finally noticed them. 6 black plastic trash bags were thrown carelessly onto the soggy grass near the old oak tree. The bags were tearing at the seams. I walked over to them, my expensive leather heels sinking deep into the mud. Through a rip in the plastic, I could see my custom-tailored silk blouses, my designer handbags, and the leather-bound portfolio containing my highly sensitive work documents. Everything was getting soaked in the Georgia mud. They had not just packed my things, they had thrown my entire life out the window like yesterday's garbage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to stick around to hear exactly how I made them pay for every single ruined silk shirt. Standing there in the rain looking at my ruined belongings, any normal person would have screamed. They would have banged on the heavy oak door until their knuckles bled. They would have cried, begged, and asked why their own mother and father would treat them with such cruelty. But I did not shed a single tear. The absolute coldness in my mother's text extinguished any warmth I had left for these people. You see, my family has always been obsessed with appearances, Yvonne and Reginald. My parents were pillars of their local church community. They hosted Sunday dinners, wore their Sunday best, and loved to brag about their perfect family. But their bragging was always exclusively reserved for my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was 29, beautiful, and completely allergic to hard work. She was the golden child who could do no wrong. When she married Trent, a 31-year-old white man who constantly used buzzwords like synergy and disruption, my parents acted like she had married royalty. Trent was a self-proclaimed tech entrepreneur. In reality, he was a guy who wore expensive hoodies, drank artisanal coffee, and lived off credit cards while waiting for his big break. My parents worshipped him. They truly believed his non-existent startup was going to make them all millionaires. Me, on the other hand, I was just the boring single older sister who worked a corporate job. I was the one who quietly handed over $1,000 in cash every single month on the first of the month. They told everyone in our extended family that it was my rent because they were generous enough to let their old maid daughter stay in her childhood bedroom. The absolute audacity of the situation washed over me as I stood in the pouring rain staring up at the second-floor window. It was the window to my room. The lights were on. I could see two figures moving around inside. Trent and Chloe. They were already moving into my space, claiming my sanctuary for his ridiculous studio. I could almost hear Trent talking about his vision board while tossing my last few items into a garbage bag. My mother had the nerve to tell me I needed to get out and live on my own. She had the nerve to change the locks on the very doors I had kept from being bolted shut by the bank. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. I did not knock. I did not yell. I pulled out my phone and took several clear, high-resolution photos of the trash bags on the lawn, making sure the timestamps and location data were perfectly captured. I walked up to the porch and took a video of the new lock on the front door. Every good auditor knows that evidence is everything. You do not argue with liars. You build a paper trail. I walked back into the yard and picked up the heaviest trash bag. It was the one containing my work laptop and financial portfolios. I dragged it to the trunk of my car. The plastic ripped further, dumping a pair of my favorite shoes straight into a puddle. I just stared at them for a second, feeling a quiet, dangerous calm settle over my mind. They thought they were dealing with a weak, desperate woman who would come crawling back begging for a couch to sleep on. They thought they held all the power because they had the house and the title of parents. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their obsession with Trent's imaginary wealth that they forgot what I did for a living. They forgot who actually held the cards. I closed the trunk of my car with a solid thud. I got back into the driver's seat, shivering as the wet fabric of my suit clung to my skin. I turned on the ignition and cranked the heater. I pulled out of the driveway without a single backward glance. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a fight on the front lawn. I was going to give them a fight in a courtroom where their tears and church credentials meant absolutely nothing. I drove toward downtown Atlanta, booking a suite at a 5-star hotel from my phone while waiting at a red light. I had a long night ahead of me. I needed to call my lawyer, I needed to draft an emergency eviction notice, and I needed to prepare the single most devastating piece of paper my parents had ever seen. Because the one detail Yvonne, Reginald, Chloe, and Trent conveniently ignored when they threw my belongings into the rain was the name on the actual deed to that house. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about real estate law. I was standing by the open trunk of my car, letting the cold rain soak through the shoulders of my blazer when the distinct sound of a sliding glass window echoed from the second floor. I looked up, wiping the water from my eyelashes. The warm yellow light from my bedroom spilled out into the dark, stormy night. Standing right in the frame of the window, looking down at me with an absolutely infuriating smirk, was my brother-in-law, Trent. Trent was 31 years old and the walking embodiment of unearned confidence. He was wearing one of those expensive zip-up fleece vests that tech billionaires wear, except Trent had absolutely zero billions and zero actual tech skills. In his hand, he held a custom ceramic mug filled with artisanal coffee that was undoubtedly brewed in the expensive espresso machine I had purchased for the kitchen last Christmas. He took a slow, dramatic sip, leaning his forearms against the windowsill, like a king surveying his muddy kingdom. "Sorry, Maya," he called out, his voice cutting through the sound of the pouring rain. "That is just the law of the hustle. When you are a founder, you have to claim your space. You are 35 now. You should really learn how to be independent and stand on your own 2 feet." The sheer audacity of his words actually made my jaw tighten. Here was a man who had not held a steady paycheck in the 3 years he had been married to my sister. He called himself a serial entrepreneur, but his entire career consisted of jumping from one failed get-rich-quick scheme to another. There was his disastrous cryptocurrency phase, where he lost thousands of dollars of my parents' money. Then there was his drop-shipping business that resulted in a garage full of cheap imported sunglasses no one wanted to buy. Now he was supposedly building an artificial intelligence app that was going to disrupt the market, but all he actually did was sit in his pajamas until noon playing video games and posting motivational quotes on social media. And this jobless leech was standing in my bedroom, telling me, a senior corporate auditor who worked 60-hour weeks, that I needed to learn how to be independent. Behind Trent's shoulder, another figure appeared. It was my younger sister, Chloe. She wrapped her arms around Trent's waist, resting her chin on his shoulder. She was wearing my thick cashmere sweater, the one I had left draped over my desk chair that morning. Chloe looked down at me, shivering in the mud, and she did not look sad or sympathetic. She simply covered her mouth with one perfectly manicured hand and let out a soft, mocking laugh. Chloe had always been the golden child. Growing up, she was the one who got the expensive pageant dresses, the private gymnastics lessons, and the brand new car on her sweet 16. My parents treated her like a fragile porcelain doll who needed constant protection from the real world. Whenever she made a mistake, she would just turn on the waterworks, and my parents would immediately rush to her defense, usually blaming me for whatever went wrong. Even now, approaching 30 years old, she played the role of the helpless princess perfectly. She had married Trent because he talked a big game and promised her a life of luxury. But when that luxury never materialized, she did not push him to get a real job. Instead, she just manipulated our parents into funding their lifestyle. And now she was laughing at me as I stood in the freezing rain looking at the wet garbage bags that contained my life. I stared back at them, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I did not yell back at Trent. I did not hurl insults at Chloe. I knew that reacting emotionally was exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to look crazy. They wanted to feel superior. Suddenly, the heavy wooden front door on the ground floor swung open with a loud creak. The bright porch light flicked on, blinding me for a second. My father, Reginald, stepped out onto the covered porch. He was a tall, imposing man who carried himself with the heavy pride of a senior church deacon. He was wearing his crisp, tailored slacks and a pressed button-down shirt, looking every bit the respected community patriarch he pretended to be. But I knew the truth about Reginald. I knew about his terrible financial decisions. I knew about the secret gambling debts he had hidden from the church congregation. I knew about the bad real estate investments that had nearly left him and my mother homeless 5 years ago. I knew all of this because I was the one who had bailed him out. But right now, he was not looking at me like a savior or even a daughter. He was looking at me like a nuisance. In his hands, he held a pair of my expensive black leather boots. They were my favorite pair, the ones I wore to important board meetings. Reginald did not even hesitate. He pulled his arm back and threw the boots right off the porch. They sailed through the rainy air and landed with a sickening splash right into a deep, muddy puddle next to the driveway. The premium leather was instantly coated in thick brown sludge. "You walk around here giving us $1,000 a month and acting like you are the queen of the castle," Reginald shouted, his deep voice booming over the storm. "You think because you have a fancy corporate job you can look down on this family. You think you are better than Trent. Trent has vision. Trent is going places. You are just a bitter old maid who does not know how to support her own flesh and blood." He pointed a thick, accusing finger at me. "Now grab your garbage and get off my property. Get lost right now before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." The words hung in the cold air. "Get off my property. Have you arrested for trespassing?" If the situation were not so incredibly serious, I might have actually laughed out loud right then and there. My father, a man who was drowning in debt, who could barely afford the property taxes on a good year, was standing on the porch of a house he did not even own, threatening to call the police on the sole legal owner of the property. He was so completely lost in his own delusions of grandeur and his desperate need to impress his useless white son-in-law that he had entirely forgotten the legal paperwork he had signed 5 years ago in my lawyer's office. When the bank had threatened to foreclose on this very house, Reginald had come to me crying. He had begged me not to let the bank take his home and ruin his reputation in the community. I had taken $150,000 of my own hard-earned savings to pay off his massive debts and stop the foreclosure. But I was not stupid. I did not just hand him the cash. I bought the house from them outright. The deed was transferred entirely into my name. The $1,000 I gave them every month was not rent. It was an allowance I gave them out of pity so they could pay the electric bill and buy groceries. They were living in my house. They were sleeping under my roof. and now they had changed the locks and were threatening to call the police on me. I looked from my father's angry face on the porch up to Trent and Chloe's smug faces in the second-floor window. They really thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied the quiet, responsible sister out of the picture so they could turn my home into their own personal playground. Trent was probably already planning how to use the house as collateral for his next failed business venture. Chloe was probably already picking out new paint colors for my bedroom. I stood there in the rain, my suit clinging to my freezing skin, and I let the absolute silence stretch between us. I wanted this moment to be burned into their memories. I wanted them to remember exactly how arrogant and cruel they were being right now. Because when the hammer finally fell, I did not want them to have a single excuse. I did not want them to be able to say they made a mistake or that they loved me. Go ahead and call them, I said, my voice completely calm and steady, carrying clearly through the rain. Call the police, Reginald. Let us get them involved. My father crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up. Do not test me, Maya. I will do it. I will have them drag you away. I did not respond. I just maintained eye contact with him until he awkwardly shifted his weight and looked away. He was a coward at heart, and he always had been. I slowly reached down and picked up my ruined leather boots from the puddle. I tossed them into the trunk of my car next to the torn garbage bags. I closed the trunk with a firm, solid thud that echoed in the driveway. I walked around to the driver's side of my car. I could feel Trent and Chloe still watching me from above, probably thinking I was finally accepting defeat and running away with my tail between my legs. I opened the car door and slid into the cold leather seat. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the pouring rain. I did not look back at the house as I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. I did not shed a tear. My mind was already calculating the next steps, moving with the cold precision of an auditor finding a massive discrepancy in a financial ledger. They wanted to play a game of real estate and power. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their entire fake kingdom to the ground. Just as my tires touched the wet asphalt of the street, the blinding flash of red and blue lights pierced through the darkness. A white Atlanta police cruiser swerved in front of my driveway, effectively blocking my exit. The heavy rain distorted the flashing lights, making the entire neighborhood look like a chaotic disco. I shifted the car back into park and let out a slow, deep breath. My father had actually done it. Reginald had actually called the cops on his own flesh and blood. I watched through my rain-slicked windshield as two uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicle. Instantly, the front door of the house flew open again. Reginald rushed out onto the porch, waving his hands frantically like a man in mortal danger. He completely ignored the pouring rain marching straight down the walkway to intercept the officers before they could even reach my car. From my rearview mirror, I could see his mouth moving a mile a minute. I rolled down my window just an inch to let the sound in. Reginald was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He told the officers that I was a disgruntled former tenant who was refusing to accept that my lease was up. He called me erratic and unpredictable. He pointed at my car and told them I was trespassing on his property and refusing to leave peacefully. Through the second-floor window, Trent and Chloe were practically pressing their faces against the glass. They were watching the scene unfold with absolute glee. They probably thought this was the grand finale of their little power trip. Watching the successful older sister get escorted away by the police would be the perfect story for Trent to tell his imaginary business partners. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, approached my driver's side door. He shined his heavy flashlight directly into my eyes, blinding me for a second. He tapped on the glass, ordering me to roll the window down entirely. I pressed the button, letting the cold wind and rain whip into the warm cabin of my car. "Mom, I need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. Now, any normal person in my position would have lost their mind right then and there. They would have screamed at the top of their lungs that they owned the property. They would have demanded the officers go inside and check the safe in the study where the original deed was kept. They would have caused a massive scene, waking up the entire neighborhood to declare their rightful ownership and expose the lie. But I am a Black woman living in America, and I am also a senior auditor. I know that shouting at the police on a dark, rainy night is never a winning strategy. More importantly, I knew that if I told the police the truth right now, they would simply label it a civil dispute over property ownership. They would tell us to take it to court and they would leave. That would give Reginald and Trent the exact warning they needed. They would realize their massive mistake, call a lawyer, and try to drag out the eviction process for months while completely destroying my house from the inside out just to punish me. I did not want to give them a warning. I wanted to drop a legal anvil on their heads when they were completely relaxed and utterly defenseless. So I stepped out of the car. I stood in the pouring rain, my expensive suit completely ruined, and I kept my posture perfectly straight. I handed the officer my driver's license without him even having to ask. I spoke in a low, calm, and entirely professional tone. "Officer, I am not here to cause a disturbance," I said. "My father is correct that I am leaving. However, I would like to officially request that you file a police report for vandalism and destruction of personal property before I go." The officer looked confused. He glanced over at Reginald, who was standing a few feet away, looking incredibly smug. Then the officer looked back at me. "What property are you referring to, ma'am?" he asked. I pointed a steady finger toward the soggy grass near the oak tree. Those black trash bags contained thousands of dollars worth of custom clothing, designer leather goods, and sensitive corporate electronics. They were deliberately thrown into the mud and rain while I was at work. The locks were changed illegally without proper notice. I just need a formal incident report documenting the damage to my belongings so I can submit it to my insurance and my civil attorney in the morning. Reginald scoffed loudly, stepping closer. "Do not listen to her. She is making things up to be difficult. It is just some old clothes. She needs to get off my land." The second officer walked over to the trash bags and shined his flashlight into the torn plastic. He clearly saw the ruined silk, the waterlogged leather portfolios, and the expensive shoes covered in muck. He walked back and nodded to his partner. "Look, ma'am," the first officer said, handing my license back to me. "We can take down your statement for an incident report regarding the damaged items. But your father is claiming to be the homeowner here, and he wants you off the premises. Because there is no formal lease agreement on paper, we have to ask you to vacate the property immediately. If you want to dispute the lockout or sue for the damages, you will have to take that up with a judge in civil court." I looked at the officer and gave him a polite nod. "I understand completely," I said. "I will handle this in court. Please just make sure the damage to the items is noted on the official record." Reginald's chest puffed out so far he looked like a proud peacock. He had heard exactly what he wanted to hear. The police had validated his authority. They had called him the homeowner. He turned around and looked up at the second-floor window, giving Trent and Chloe a big triumphant thumbs up. I could see Chloe clapping her hands together in absolute delight. The officers took down my brief statement, noting the estimated value of the ruined items and the conditions they were found in. They gave me a slip of paper with an incident number on it. That little piece of paper was all I needed. It was the golden ticket that proved Reginald and Yvonne had executed an illegal lockout and deliberately destroyed my property. They had just handed me the very evidence that would force them to pay me back for every single ruined item during the eviction settlement. "All right, it is time for you to move along now," the officer said, stepping back from my car. I got back into the driver's seat and closed the door. The heater blasted warm air over my freezing hands, but I did not feel the cold anymore. I shifted the car into drive. I looked out the window one last time. Reginald was standing on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, a massive, arrogant smile plastered across his face. He truly believed he had beaten me. He believed he had successfully discarded his eldest daughter to make room for his worthless son-in-law. I did not glare at him. I did not yell out the window. I simply gave him a small, tight smile that he probably mistook for total defeat. I pulled around the police cruiser and drove off into the rainy night, leaving the neighborhood behind. As I drove toward downtown Atlanta, the silence in the car was deafening. My phone was completely quiet. No texts from my mother asking if I was safe driving in the storm. No calls from my sister apologizing for the cruelty. They had completely erased me from their lives the moment I pulled out of that driveway. But as the bright city lights began to reflect on my windshield, a deep sense of power washed over me. They thought they had locked me out of their family. They did not realize they had just locked themselves in a trap they could never escape. I navigated the slick streets of downtown Atlanta, pulling up to the brightly lit valet stand of one of the most exclusive luxury hotels in the city. The valet opened my car door looking slightly concerned at my soaked suit and ruined hair, but I simply handed him my keys and walked straight into the gleaming marble lobby. My parents thought they had left me destitute on the streets. They truly believed I was a struggling woman who would be sleeping in my car or crying on a friend's couch. They had absolutely no idea that I managed a massive portfolio of high net worth clients and had amassed significant wealth of my own. When I approached the front desk, I did not hand the concierge a standard bank card. I reached into my bag and handed him my heavy metal black card. I booked their top-tier penthouse suite for the next 2 weeks without even blinking at the price. The concierge swiped the card, gave me a warm professional smile, and handed me the key to a room that cost more per night than the entire monthly allowance I gave my father. The suite was a massive expanse of modern luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. I peeled off my ruined wet clothes and stepped into a steaming rainfall shower, letting the scalding water wash away the cold mud and the lingering stench of my family's betrayal. After I dried off, I wrapped myself in a plush white robe, ordered expensive room service, and sat down at the mahogany desk in the living area. I pulled out my backup work phone and dialed the number of my college best friend and personal real estate attorney, Desmond. He picked up on the second ring despite the late hour. Desmond. I said, my voice completely flat and steady. It happened exactly the way we predicted. They changed the locks and threw my things on the lawn. Desmond let out a low, sharp breath over the phone. He knew my family history intimately. He knew exactly what kind of people Reginald and Yvonne were because he had helped me draw up the paperwork when I saved them from foreclosure 5 years ago. He asked me if I had called the police to document the scene. I told him my father had actually called them for me, and that I had the official incident report number for the destroyed property. Then I gave him the green light. Start the process immediately, Desmond. I want an emergency eviction notice filed first thing in the morning. They are month-to-month tenants who just executed an illegal lockout on the legal owner of the property. I want no mercy. Desmond chuckled darkly and said he would have the papers drafted and sent to the county sheriff before breakfast. We hung up and I drank my wine looking out over the city. I slept better that night than I had in years. I woke up the next morning to the smell of fresh coffee from the room service cart and a phone that was vibrating violently off the nightstand. It was not my parents calling to apologize. It was a tidal wave of notifications from social media and dozens of text messages from my extended family members. I opened my phone and immediately saw what had caused the sudden storm. My sister Chloe had posted a video on her social media account. I clicked on it and watched her award-winning performance. She was standing in the middle of my living room, wearing a perfectly styled casual outfit, looking into the camera with big fake tear-filled eyes. In the video, Chloe talked about how incredibly hard her husband Trent had been working on his new tech startup. She claimed that my parents were so proud of Trent's vision and work ethic that they had officially gifted them the family home to help them build their future empire. Then she seamlessly turned the narrative toward me. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek and told her thousands of followers about her bitter older sister. She painted me as a toxic 35-year-old freeloader who had been living off our elderly parents for years. She claimed I refused to leave and had to be forcibly removed from the property for the safety and peace of the family. Trent even made a cameo in the background of the video, carrying a cardboard box into my old bedroom, looking like the hard-working, humble hero of the story. The video had gone completely viral overnight. The comments section was flooded with strangers calling me a parasite and praising Chloe and Trent for setting healthy boundaries with a toxic family member. But the worst part was not the strangers on the internet. It was my own flesh and blood. My inbox was full of messages from my Aunt Shirley, my Uncle David, and various cousins. Aunt Shirley sent a massive paragraph calling me a disgrace to the family name. She said I should be deeply ashamed of myself for taking advantage of my parents and trying to ruin my younger sister's happiness just because I was jealous. Uncle David told me I was a bitter spinster who could not handle the fact that Chloe had found a successful white husband while I was still single. My cousins chimed in, calling me selfish and telling me to never show my face at a family gathering again. They were all falling over themselves to defend Reginald and Yvonne. They were so eager to tear me down that none of them stopped to ask a very simple logical question. How could a man who had nearly gone bankrupt and lost his house 5 years ago suddenly afford to gift a massive colonial home to his unemployed son-in-law? They did not ask because they did not care about the truth. They just wanted a scapegoat, and I had always been their favorite target. I sat on the edge of the plush hotel bed watching the video loop over and over again. I did not feel hurt. I did not feel sad. I felt a cold, sharp sense of absolute satisfaction. Chloe was publicly claiming ownership of a house she did not own. Trent was documenting himself moving into a property from which he was about to be legally evicted. And my extended family was putting all their toxic abuse and blind loyalty right there in writing. I took screenshots of every single text message from my aunts and uncles. I downloaded Chloe's viral video directly to my secure cloud storage. As an auditor, I lived for documentation. My family thought they were destroying my reputation, but they were actually just building an airtight legal case for me. They were digging a hole so deep that none of them would ever be able to climb out. I got up and dressed in a fresh, custom-tailored suit I had delivered from a boutique that morning. I checked my reflection in the mirror, adjusting my collar. My phone buzzed one more time. It was a text from Desmond. It simply read that the sheriff had received the paperwork and was heading out. The legal gears were already turning. My family thought they had weathered the storm by kicking me out, but they had no idea that the real hurricane was currently driving a police cruiser right toward their front door. I was just putting my phone down on the mahogany desk when another notification vibrated against the wood. I looked at the screen expecting another angry message from a distant cousin, but the name flashing was Yvonne, my mother. She did not ask how I was doing after spending the night in a severe thunderstorm. She did not ask where I slept. Her message was brief and entirely demanding. She told me to meet her at noon at a pretentious French cafe in the upscale Buckhead district. She wrote that since I was officially out of the house, we needed to finalize some legal paperwork regarding the property so the family could move forward. I stared at the message, and a cold, genuine smile spread across my face. She wanted to talk about legal paperwork. That was the most wonderful thing she could have possibly said to me. I arrived at the cafe exactly at noon. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and bright under the midday sun. I walked through the glass doors of the cafe wearing my brand new custom-tailored suit, my hair perfectly styled, and my expensive leather tote resting on my shoulder. I did not look like a woman who had been rendered homeless 12 hours ago. I looked like the senior corporate auditor I was, a woman who managed millions of dollars in assets before my morning coffee. I spotted Yvonne sitting at a corner table near the window. She was wearing her signature Sunday church pearls, a crisp beige blouse, and her hair was perfectly pressed. She was sipping sparkling water with a slice of lemon, looking around the room to make sure the wealthy patrons noticed her. My mother lived for the illusion of wealth. She would starve for a week just to afford a designer handbag so the other ladies at the country club would think she was rich. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, crossing my legs. I did not say a word. I just looked at her, waiting for her to speak. Yvonne looked me up and down. I could see a brief flash of confusion in her eyes. She had fully expected me to walk in looking completely defeated, with red, puffy eyes and wrinkled clothes, begging to be let back into my childhood bedroom. Seeing me look absolutely flawless and unbothered clearly threw her off balance, but her deeply ingrained arrogance quickly took over again. She did not bother with pleasantries. She reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slapped it down on the marble table and slid it across to me. "I need you to sign these documents right now, Maya," she said, her tone sharp and authoritative. "It is a quitclaim deed. We had the family lawyer drafted up this morning. It legally removes your name from the property title and transfers full ownership back to your father and me." I did not touch the envelope. I simply looked at it and then back up at her. I asked her why in the world she thought I would ever sign such a document, especially after she had thrown my entire life onto a muddy lawn. Yvonne leaned forward, lowering her voice so the neighboring tables would not hear her, but the venom in her words was unmistakable. She told me that Trent needed capital. She said his tech startup was finally ready to launch, and he needed $200,000 to secure the servers and hire a marketing team. She explained that Trent and Chloe had gone to the bank to apply for a home equity line of credit using the house as collateral. But the loan officer had flagged the application because my name was the only one listed on the actual deed. My mother looked at me with absolute disdain. She said I was being incredibly selfish by holding the family back. She told me it was my duty as the older sister to step aside and support my younger sibling. Then she delivered the line that summarized her entire worldview. "Chloe found a good white man with a bright future," Yvonne whispered harshly. "Trent comes from a good background. He thinks big. He is a visionary. He is going to elevate this entire family to a completely different tax bracket. You are 35 years old and single, Maya. You just work a boring desk job. You are never going to build an empire. You need to sign this paper so the people who actually have a future can get to work." The internalized racism and sheer financial ignorance in her statement were staggering. My own mother, a black woman who had struggled her entire life, was sitting in front of me praising a completely mediocre, unemployed white man while tearing down her highly successful black daughter. She genuinely believed that Trent's skin color and his use of tech buzzwords made him inherently superior to me. She was willing to risk the roof over her own head to fund the delusions of a man who had never held a steady job. My professional auditor brain immediately broke down the absolute absurdity of their plan. A home equity line of credit requires not just equity in a property, but also a verifiable income to prove you can repay the monthly installments. Trent had no income. Chloe had no income. Even if I did sign the house over to them, the bank would laugh them out of the lobby the moment they looked at Trent's disastrous credit score. But more importantly, if they somehow miraculously got the loan and Trent inevitably failed to pay it back, the bank would foreclose on the house. Yvonne was literally begging me to hand over my legal property so she could make herself homeless for the second time in her life. I reached out and picked up the manila envelope. I slid the thick stack of legal papers out and placed them on the table. Yvonne let out a satisfied sigh, thinking I was finally submitting to her will. She reached into her purse and pulled out an expensive gold pen, holding it out to me. "Sign the bottom of the third page and initial the margins," she instructed, tapping her manicured fingernail on the paper. "Do not make this any harder than it has to be, Maya. Once you sign this, we can be a family again. You can come to Thanksgiving dinner as a guest." I looked at the gold pen in her hand. Then I looked down at the carefully drafted quitclaim deed. I reached out, but I did not take the pen. Instead, I grabbed the top edge of the thick stack of papers with both hands. I maintained dead eye contact with my mother as I pulled my hands in opposite directions. The sound of thick legal paper ripping echoed loudly in the quiet upscale cafe. Yvonne gasped loudly, her eyes going wide as saucers. "Maya, what are you doing?" she hissed, looking around frantically as a few nearby diners turned their heads to look at us. I did not answer her. I placed the torn halves of the document together and ripped them again down the middle. I tore the paper into smaller and smaller pieces until the document was nothing but a pile of jagged, useless confetti. I picked up the pile of shredded paper and dropped it directly into her glass of sparkling water. The pieces floated for a second before sinking to the bottom, turning the clear water into a cloudy, pulpy mess. Are you completely out of your mind? Yvonne demanded, her face turning a dark shade of red. Do you have any idea how much it cost to have that drafted? You are ruining your sister's future. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the marble table. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly calm so she would hear every single word clearly. I am not ruining anything, I told her. I am simply refusing to fund a jobless leech. You and Reginald completely bankrupted yourselves 5 years ago, and I used my hard-earned money to buy that house so you would not end up sleeping in a shelter. The deed is in my name because I bought it. It is my property. You are a tenant. And as of last night, you are a tenant who has committed an illegal eviction and destroyed thousands of dollars of the landlord's personal property. Yvonne opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The absolute reality of the situation was finally starting to pierce through her thick armor of delusion. I stood up from the table, smoothing out the front of my suit jacket. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was never quite good enough. You changed the locks on my house, I said quietly. You threw my belongings into the mud. You told me to get out, so I got out. But you made one fatal miscalculation, Yvonne. You forgot who actually owns the dirt you are standing on. I reached into my designer bag, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and dropped it onto the table next to her ruined glass of water. Pay for your drink, I told her, because Trent is certainly not going to pay for it. I turned around and walked out of the cafe, the sharp click of my heels echoing against the hardwood floor. I did not look back. I stepped out into the bright Atlanta afternoon, feeling lighter than I had in over 3 decades. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I walked toward my car. It was another text from Desmond. The papers were signed by the judge. The sheriff was officially holding the 72-hour notice to quit. The countdown to their complete destruction had officially begun. I drove back to my hotel suite with a sense of absolute clarity. The rain from the previous night had completely washed away any lingering guilt or misplaced loyalty I might have held for my parents. I walked into the lobby, rode the private elevator up to the penthouse, and stepped into the quiet luxury of my room. I placed my leather tote on the mahogany table and took out my laptop to review the digital copies of the eviction documents Desmond had just sent me. Everything was perfectly in order. The county judge had reviewed my original deed, the property tax records, and the incident report from the police, and had signed the 72-hour notice to quit without hesitation. As I was reading through the legal jargon, my personal phone began to ring. I glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. Yvonne had undoubtedly run crying back to the house to tell everyone that her ungrateful daughter had ripped up the quitclaim deed in the middle of a fancy restaurant. I let it ring 3 times before I reached over and tapped the screen to answer. I did not say hello. I simply held the phone to my ear and waited. Maya, it is Trent. The voice on the other end was dripping with unearned confidence and forced casualness. I am calling you from my new business line. We need to have a little chat. I immediately reached into my bag, pulled out my secure work phone, and opened the voice recording application. I placed my personal phone on the desk, turned on the speaker, and hit record on the second device. Every corporate auditor knows that when a liar calls you unexpectedly, you document every single syllable. I am listening, Trent. I said, my voice completely neutral. Trent let out a loud, exaggerated sigh directly into the microphone. Look, Maya, your mother came home completely hysterical a few minutes ago. She said you threw a massive temper tantrum at the cafe and tore up the paperwork. I told her not to worry about it. Yvonne is a sweet lady, but she does not understand how business works. She operates on emotion. I am a founder. I operate on logic and leverage. So I figured I would step in and handle this man to man, so to speak. The sheer arrogance of his words made me raise an eyebrow. This unemployed man who was currently living in my house for free was talking to me, a senior financial auditor, as if he were a Fortune 500 chief executive negotiating a corporate merger. You see, Maya Trent continued his tone, taking on a patronizing edge. I understand why you are acting out. I really do. You are a single black woman pushing 40. You work a stressful corporate job where you probably feel undervalued, and you come home to an empty apartment. Meanwhile, your younger sister is beautiful, she is happily married to a guy with a massive future, and we are about to build generational wealth. It is natural for you to feel a little jealous and bitter. You have what I call a scarcity mindset. I stared at the recording app, watching the red audio waves spike with his every word. He was not just insulting me. He was leaning into the same subtle racial and gendered microaggressions that I had faced from mediocre white men my entire professional career. He genuinely believed that, because of his skin color and his gender, he was inherently smarter and more valuable than me. But you are letting your emotions get in the way of a massive opportunity, Trent said. I have my loan officer on speed dial. The bank absolutely loves my business model. They are ready to release $200,000 to my startup account by next week. We are just waiting to clear up this tiny clerical error with the house title. Your name being on the deed is just a technicality from when you helped your dad with a little loan a few years ago. We both know this is Reginald and Yvonne's house. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. A technicality, a little loan. He was talking about a $150,000 cash buyout to stop a bank foreclosure. And his claim about the loan officer was a blatant, hilarious lie. No bank in the United States of America is going to approve a home equity line of credit for a property that the applicant does not legally own. Furthermore, a bank does not just hand over $200,000 to a man with no verifiable income, a history of failed businesses, and maxed out credit cards. Trent was bluffing. He was trying to intimidate me with imaginary money and fake corporate authority. If you just sign a new copy of the deed, Trent said, his voice dropping into what he probably thought was an intimidating register, I will make sure you get a little piece of the pie when my company goes public. Maybe a few $1,000s to help you buy some new clothes since yours got a little wet last night. But if you keep being difficult, Maya, I am going to have to play hardball. He paused, waiting for me to react. When I remained perfectly silent, he continued, I will tell Reginald and Yvonne to cut you off completely. You will be permanently banned from this family. No Thanksgiving, no Christmas, no weddings. You will die alone in your little apartment. And honestly, Maya, if you keep holding up my business funding, I might just have my lawyers sue you for lost wages and emotional distress. Do not test an alpha male when it comes to his empire. You will lose. So I am going to email you a fresh copy of the deed, sign it, get it notarized, and send it back by tomorrow morning. Are we clear? He had just threatened me with isolation extortion and a completely baseless lawsuit, all while confirming on a recorded line that he knew the house legally belonged to me. It was a masterpiece of self-incrimination. Are we clear? Maya Trent demanded again, his temper flaring slightly at my continued silence. I leaned closer to the phone. Is that all, Trent? I asked, my voice soft and perfectly polite. Are you absolutely certain the bank is releasing the funds to you next week? Yes. Trent snapped quickly, falling right into the trap. The money is secured. The bank is just waiting on you to stop being a stubborn old maid and sign the paper. We are the owners of this house now. You are just a guest who overstayed her welcome. Thank you for clarifying that, Trent, I said. I will be sure to handle the paperwork exactly the way it needs to be handled. Have a wonderful evening. Before he could say another word, I ended the call. I reached over to my work phone and hit the stop button on the recording app. I saved the audio file, backing it up immediately to 2 separate secure cloud servers and emailing a copy directly to Desmond. I sat back in my chair and let out a long, satisfied breath. Trent thought he had just delivered a masterclass in negotiation. He thought he had intimidated the sad, lonely sister into submission. He had no idea that he had just handed me the final nail for his own coffin. If my parents or Trent tried to go to a judge and claim that they had a verbal agreement to live in the house or that they had some sort of tenant rights, this recording would destroy them. It proved premeditated financial coercion. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city lights of Atlanta. It was Thursday evening. The streets below were bustling with people heading home from work or going out for dinner. Somewhere in the suburbs, my parents and my sister were probably sitting around my expensive dining room table drinking wine and celebrating their victory. They were probably praising Trent for putting me in my place. They were probably making plans on how to spend the $200,000 that did not exist. I checked the time on my watch. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. In exactly 14 hours, the sun would rise on Friday morning. And on Friday mornings in Fulton County, the Civil Enforcement Division of the Sheriff's Department begins their daily rounds. I ordered a very expensive steak dinner from room service, poured myself a glass of red wine, and went to sleep with a smile on my face. The trap was fully set. The evidence was secured. My family had spent my entire life treating me like a stepping stone, and tomorrow morning they were going to find out exactly what happens when that stone breaks their ankles. Friday morning arrived in Atlanta, with bright, crisp sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel suite. I woke up feeling completely refreshed. I ordered a pot of black coffee and a plate of fresh fruit from room service. I sat at the mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up Trent's public social media page. I knew his routine perfectly. Every morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Trent went live to talk about his entrepreneurial journey. Sure enough, his profile picture glowed with a red ring indicating he was currently broadcasting. I clicked on the stream and leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Trent was standing in the middle of my old bedroom. He had already moved my antique vanity out into the hallway and replaced it with a cheap, modern standing desk. He was wearing a fitted turtleneck sweater, looking directly into the camera with an incredibly smug expression. He was pacing back and forth, talking to his viewers about the importance of securing a dedicated workspace to manifest financial energy. He told his audience that true wealth requires sacrifice, and sometimes that means making tough decisions to cut dead weight out of your life. He was obviously referencing me. Chloe walked into the frame holding 2 cups of expensive coffee, handing one to Trent with a loving smile. She told the viewers how proud she was of her husband for finally claiming the space he deserved to build their empire. I watched the viewer count in the corner of the screen. There were about 400 people watching live, most likely people who had followed Chloe after her viral video the day before. They were all tuned in to see the successful couple in their newly acquired home. Then it happened. A massive, heavy pounding echoed through the house. The sound was so loud it actually made Trent jump, slightly dropping his entrepreneurial persona for a split second. The pounding came from the front door downstairs. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, authoritative strike of law enforcement. Trent quickly recovered his composure. He smiled at the camera and told his viewers to hold on for a second while he went to sign for what he assumed was a delivery of new computer equipment. He kept the live stream running, holding his phone in front of him as he walked out of my room and down the main staircase. Chloe followed closely behind him. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, my father Reginald stepped out of the kitchen holding a newspaper. Yvonne was right behind him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. They all walked toward the front entrance together, a picture-perfect family, completely unaware that a legal bomb was waiting on the other side of the wood. Trent pulled open the heavy front door, still holding his phone up high so his viewers could see. Standing on the front porch were 2 uniformed deputies from the Fulton County Sheriff's Office, Civil Enforcement Division. They were large, imposing men wearing bulletproof vests and stern expressions. One of them held a thick clipboard and a bright red piece of paper. Trent immediately tried to assert his dominance. He puffed out his chest and asked the officers how he could help them using his deepest, most authoritative voice. He probably thought they were there to follow up on the police report from Tuesday night. He probably thought they had come to arrest me to finish the job he started. The lead deputy looked at Trent and then looked down at his clipboard. He asked if he was speaking to Reginald or Trent. Reginald stepped forward, pushing past Trent slightly. He proudly puffed out his chest and declared that he was Reginald, the homeowner and the head of the household. The deputy did not smile. He did not acknowledge Reginald's self-appointed authority. Instead, he stepped forward and slapped the bright red piece of paper directly onto the center of the wooden front door, pressing down firmly on the adhesive strip. The camera caught the bold black letters printed at the very top of the red paper. It read, 72-hour notice to quit. Trent stared at the paper, his face suddenly draining of all color. Reginald frowned deeply, leaning in to read the words. Yvonne let out a sharp gasp from the back of the hallway. The deputy cleared his throat and began to read the official court order out loud, his voice carrying clearly over the live stream for all 400 viewers to hear. He stated that by order of the Fulton County Civil Court, the current occupants of the premises were ordered to vacate the property immediately. He stated that the occupants were classified as month-to-month tenants without a formal lease agreement. He then stated the most devastating sentence of all. He said that the occupants had executed an illegal lockout and destroyed the personal property of the sole legal owner of the estate. Reginald's face turned a dark shade of purple. He began to stammer, waving his hands frantically in the air. He yelled at the deputy, telling him there must be a massive mistake. He insisted that he was the owner of the house and that his daughter Maya was just a disgruntled former tenant who was trying to cause trouble. He started rambling about a little loan from 5 years ago and how the deed was just a technicality. The deputy held up a hand, cutting Reginald off completely. He looked Reginald dead in the eye and spoke with absolute legal authority. He told Reginald that there was no mistake. He said the judge had personally reviewed the original property deed, the mortgage payoff statements, and the county tax records. He stated clearly that Maya was the only person listed on the title. He told Reginald that Maya was the sole legal landlord and that Reginald, Yvonne, Chloe, and Trent had broken the law by changing the locks on her. The silence that followed was absolute. The reality of the situation crashed down on them like a concrete wall. The deputy continued his instructions, completely ignoring their shock. He pointed at the red paper on the door. He told them they had exactly 72 hours to pack their belongings and leave the premises voluntarily. He warned them that if they were still inside the house when the deadline expired, the sheriff's department would return to physically remove them, and their belongings would be placed on the curb. Then he delivered the final blow. He looked directly at Trent and told him that any attempt to remove fixtures, appliances, or damage the property on the way out would result in immediate criminal charges for felony vandalism. Yvonne began to cry. Not her usual fake manipulative tears, but genuine panicked sobbing. She grabbed Reginald's arm, asking him what they were going to do and where they were going to go. Reginald was completely speechless. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The man who had thrown my shoes into the mud just a few days ago was now trembling in his expensive slippers. Chloe turned to Trent, her eyes wide with panic, expecting her successful alpha male husband to fix the situation. But Trent was frozen. He was staring at this deputy, completely paralyzed by the sudden destruction of his entire fake reality. In his state of pure shock, Trent had completely forgotten about the phone in his hand. The camera was still pointing directly at the red eviction notice on the door, and the chat section of his live stream was exploding. I sat in my hotel room watching the comments fly by at lightning speed. The viewers who had been praising him just 5 minutes earlier were now tearing him apart. People were typing in all caps, asking why the successful tech founder was being evicted. They were calling him a squatter. They were laughing at the fact that he was living in his sister-in-law's house for free while pretending to be a millionaire. Someone commented that Chloe had lied in her viral video and that they were actually the toxic family members who had kicked out the real homeowner. Trent finally looked down at his screen. I watched the exact moment his soul left his body. He saw the hundreds of comments mocking his fake wealth and exposing his lies. He saw his entire carefully crafted online persona disintegrating in real time. He frantically tapped the screen, his hands shaking violently as he tried to end the broadcast. The video feed suddenly cut to black. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow breath. I picked up my coffee cup and took another sip. It tasted absolutely incredible. They had wanted a public spectacle, They had wanted to use social media to humiliate me and paint themselves as the successful righteous victims. But the internet is a permanent record, and Trent had just broadcasted his own absolute financial ruin to the entire world. There was no way to spin a visit from the sheriff's department. There was no way to hide a bright red eviction notice stuck to the front door for everyone in the neighborhood to see. My phone immediately started buzzing on the desk. It was my father, then my mother, then my sister. They were calling me back to back, desperately trying to reach the daughter they had thrown into the rain just 3 days ago. I did not answer a single call. I simply picked up my phone and turned on the Do Not Disturb feature. Let them panic. Let them scramble. Let them finally understand the true weight of the consequences they had brought upon themselves. I had a busy day ahead of me, working with my high-net-worth clients, and I did not have time to listen to the apologies of a family who only loved me when they needed a place to live. The 72-hour countdown had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. I spent the entire afternoon at my corporate office going through complex financial spreadsheets and conducting high-level audits. I kept my phone safely tucked away in my desk drawer with the Do Not Disturb feature firmly activated. I knew that every single hour that passed was another hour of pure, unadulterated panic for the people sitting in my house. I let the silence do the heavy lifting. I wanted the reality of that bright red eviction notice to completely sink into their bones before I gave them the privilege of hearing my voice. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, I packed up my briefcase and drove back to my luxury hotel suite. I ordered a light dinner, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and sat down at the mahogany desk. It was finally time. I picked up my phone, disabled the silent mode, and placed it flat on the table. It took exactly 14 seconds for the screen to light up. The caller ID flashed my father's name. They had clearly been taking turns calling me all day, waiting for a single ring to go through. I tapped the green button and put the phone on speaker. I did not say hello. I just let the line open and waited for them to speak. Reginald spoke first, and his voice was completely unrecognizable. The deep, booming tone of the proud church patriarch was entirely gone. In its place was the breathy, frantic sound of a man who had just watched his entire world collapse. "Maya, what are you doing?" he shouted, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. "What the hell is going on here? Why did the county sheriff just come to my house and put a notice on my door? Is this some kind of sick joke? How could you do this to your own parents? You are going to embarrass us in front of the entire neighborhood." In the background, I could hear my mother Yvonne crying loudly. It was not her usual manipulative weeping used to get her way. It was the raw, ugly sound of genuine terror. I could hear her pacing back and forth, yelling at Reginald to make me stop this madness. I sat back in my chair and let him finish his frantic rant. I let the dead silence stretch over the phone line for a few agonizing seconds just to make him sweat. When I finally spoke, my voice was perfectly level and completely devoid of any emotion. "It is not a joke, Reginald," I said calmly. "I am the sole legal owner of that property, and I have been for the last 5 years. You seem to have forgotten that the $1,000 I handed you on the first of every month was never rent. It was an allowance. I gave you pocket money out of the goodness of my heart so you could pay the electric bill and buy groceries because you and Yvonne completely bankrupted yourselves." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He tried to speak, but I cut him off sharply. "You lived in my house rent-free." I continued, my tone dropping to a cold whisper. "And how did you repay me? You changed the locks on the homeowner. You packed my expensive clothing and highly sensitive corporate documents into garbage bags and threw them into the freezing rain. You stood on the porch and proudly told 2 sworn police officers that you were the homeowner while illegally locking out the actual landlord." Reginald began to stutter. He literally could not form a complete sentence. The sheer weight of his own arrogant mistakes was crushing him. He tried to backtrack, his voice cracking pathetically. "Maya, please," he stammered. "We were just angry. Trent needed the room for his business, and we thought you were financially secure enough to find an apartment. We are family. We can figure this out. Just call the sheriff and cancel the notice so we can go back to normal. We can talk about this like adults." Suddenly, there was a loud scuffle on the other end of the line. The sound of the phone fumbling against a hand echoed through the speaker. Yvonne had snatched the device away from my father. "Maya, please listen to me." Yvonne cried, her voice shrill and desperate. She had completely dropped the facade of the proud, wealthy country club mother. She was practically hyperventilating directly into the receiver. Trent was mistaken. He pushed us into this. It was all Trent's idea to change the locks and kick you out. We never meant to hurt you, Maya. We just wanted to help Chloe, and we went along with it to keep the peace in the house. You cannot put us on the street. It was absolutely pathetic. The moment their free ride was threatened, my parents immediately turned on their golden child and the precious white son-in-law they had worshipped just 24 hours ago. They were throwing Trent completely under the bus in a desperate attempt to save their own skin. I interrupted my mother's sobbing. I did not have an ounce of pity left for her. "You are a grown woman, Yvonne," I said sharply. "You made your own choices. You chose to send me that cruel text message. You chose to sit across from me in a cafe yesterday and try to manipulate me into signing away my legal property so you could fund a jobless leech. You made your bed, and now you are going to sleep on the curb." "Maya." "No." Yvonne screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "Please do not do this to us. We have nowhere to go. Trent has no money. We have no savings." I leaned closer to the phone, staring at the glowing green call timer on the screen. "The 72-hour countdown is not a suggestion," I told her, my voice cutting through her cries like a knife. "It is a legal mandate from the county court. If you and your precious son-in-law are not completely out of my house by Monday morning, the deputies will physically drag you out and dump your belongings on the lawn for everyone in your church community to see." I paused, letting that image burn into her mind. I let her picture the sheer humiliation of her country club friends driving by and seeing her sitting on the sidewalk surrounded by trash bags. And as for my ruined leather boots and my destroyed work laptop, I added, my voice turning to pure ice. "I will see you in court." I reached out and tapped the red button, ending the call instantly. The hotel room fell back into a peaceful, quiet silence. I did not block their numbers. As an auditor, I knew the value of a comprehensive paper trail. I wanted a full digital log of every single desperate text message and every frantic missed call they were about to send me. I wanted the judge to see exactly how quickly their arrogance turned to desperation when the real world finally caught up with them. My phone began to ring again almost immediately. I simply turned the screen face down on the desk and walked over to the window. The city of Atlanta was glowing against the night sky. For the first time in my 35 years of life, I was completely free from the heavy, toxic chains of their expectations. The fake empire they had tried to build on my back was currently burning to the ground, and I had absolutely no intention of handing them a bucket of water. Saturday morning arrived with a quiet sense of victory. I woke up, made myself a cup of tea, and opened my laptop. I knew that the internet never forgets, and I was absolutely right. Trent shutting down his live stream the day before was entirely useless. Several of his viewers had been screen recording the entire broadcast. By midnight, someone had taken the footage of the sheriff handing them the eviction notice and spliced it perfectly with the video Chloe had posted the day before, where she claimed I was a toxic freeloader. The contrast was absolute cinematic perfection. In the first half of the video, Chloe was crying fake tears, and Trent was pretending to be a wealthy homeowner. In the second half, the sheriff was loudly declaring on a public broadcast that Maya was the sole legal owner and that they were all being evicted for an illegal lockout. The internet absolutely loves a hypocrite getting exposed, and the video spread like wildfire. It did not take long for the digital footprint to reach the real world. My parents' social circle in Atlanta was built entirely on church attendance and country club gossip. Yvonne had spent years carefully cultivating an image of a wealthy, blessed family. Reginald loved to stand at the church podium and lecture younger men about financial responsibility, and being the head of the household. By Saturday afternoon, the spliced video had made its way into the private group chats of the church choir, the deacon board, and the neighborhood homeowners association. The carefully constructed illusion of the perfect family shattered into a million pieces overnight. My backup phone, the one I used for family communication, started buzzing relentlessly. I did not answer any calls, but I did read the text messages as they flooded in. The shift in tone from my extended family was nothing short of comedic. Aunt Shirley, who just 2 days ago had sent me a massive paragraph calling me a bitter spinster and a disgrace to the family name, was suddenly singing a completely different tune. She sent me a long, rambling text, apologizing for rushing to judgment. She claimed she always knew there was something sketchy about Trent, and that she never truly believed I would take advantage of my parents. She asked if we could meet for lunch, so she could properly apologize. She just wanted to make sure she was on the right side of the fence now that she realized I was the one holding the checkbook. Uncle David, the man who told me I was jealous of Chloe's white husband, sent a message saying he was absolutely disgusted by Reginald's behavior. He told me he had just called my father and reprimanded him for treating me so poorly. They were all scrambling like rats on a sinking ship, trying to secure their relationship with the successful daughter before the rest of the family went completely broke. I did not reply to a single one of them. I took screenshots of their pathetic apologies and filed them away, right next to their original insults. I knew they did not suddenly love or respect me. They simply respected the fact that I had the power to buy a house in cash and the ruthlessness to evict my own parents. They were afraid of me, and honestly, I preferred their fear over their fake affection. While my extended family was trying to do damage control, Chloe was experiencing the complete destruction of her online reality. Her social media accounts, which had been her main source of validation and self-worth, were under siege. Thousands of strangers were flooding her comment sections. They were calling her out for lying about the house. They were tagging Trent and asking him how his imaginary startup was going to function from a cardboard box on the sidewalk. People were analyzing her older posts, pointing out the designer clothes and expensive vacations, and asking if she bought those with the rent money her older sister paid. Chloe tried to fight back at first. She posted a frantic text update claiming the sheriff was mistaken and that her family was the victim of a massive legal misunderstanding. She said they had lawyers working on it and that the truth would come out soon. But the internet is merciless. Someone found the public property tax records for the house and posted a screenshot of the official county website. It showed my name, Maya, clearly listed as the sole owner with a purchase date going back 5 years. That was the final blow. Chloe could not argue with public county records. The comments became even more brutal, mocking her for trying to double down on a proven lie. By Saturday evening, the pressure became too much for the golden child to handle. I refreshed her page to see if she had posted another excuse, but the screen went blank. An error message popped up, saying the page was not found. Chloe had completely deactivated all of her social media accounts. She had locked herself away in the dark, unable to face the public humiliation of being exposed as a fraud. Trent was not faring any better. His professional networking profiles were suddenly flooded with people asking about his eviction. The few desperate tech founders who actually associated with him were rapidly distancing themselves from the public relations nightmare. Trent had built his entire identity on the illusion of success and leverage. Now everyone knew he was just a broke 31-year-old man who had to trick his elderly in-laws into kicking out his sister-in-law just so he could have a free place to sleep. The wave of public backlash was doing exactly what I needed it to do. It was isolating them. My parents could not run to their church friends for financial help because their church friends were currently gossiping about them. Chloe and Trent could not launch a crowdfunding campaign or ask the internet for sympathy because the internet had already labeled them as scammers. They had absolutely nowhere to turn and no one to blame but themselves. The walls were closing in on them rapidly. They had less than 48 hours left before the county deputies returned to physically remove them from the property. I spent my Saturday evening treating myself to a deep tissue massage at the hotel spa. I laid on the heated table, listening to soft instrumental music, while my parents were likely tearing the house apart in a blind panic, trying to figure out how to pack up 30 years of accumulated belongings in a single weekend. I felt a profound sense of peace settling over my mind. For years, I had carried the weight of their financial mistakes and their emotional abuse. I had allowed them to make me feel small in my own home. But as the masseuse worked the tension out of my shoulders, I realized that the heavy burden was finally gone. I had not just evicted them from my property, I had evicted them from my mind. I was ready for Monday morning, and I was ready to watch them walk out of my front door for the very last time. Monday morning arrived with the heavy gray skies typical of an Atlanta autumn. The 72-hour notice had officially expired at 9 o'clock, but instead of packing their bags, my family had chosen the path of maximum resistance. On late Friday afternoon, Reginald had managed to scrape together enough money to hire a discount strip mall attorney who filed a desperate emergency injunction to temporarily halt the physical removal of their property. That legally forced us into a dispute resolution hearing in front of a county judge. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought bringing me to a courtroom would intimidate me into backing down to avoid public embarrassment. They had absolutely no idea they had just willingly walked into a legal slaughterhouse. I walked into the Fulton County Courthouse wearing a tailored charcoal suit that commanded absolute respect. My hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, and my expression was as unreadable as stone. Desmond, my attorney and trusted friend, walked right beside me carrying a thick black leather binder. We pushed open the heavy oak doors of the assigned courtroom and stepped inside. My entire family was already sitting at the plaintiff's table. The contrast between our two sides was almost comical. Desmond and I looked like corporate executives preparing for a hostile takeover. My family looked like a complete disaster. Reginald was wearing his best Sunday church suit, sitting with his chest puffed out and his chin raised high. He was still desperately clinging to the delusion that his authority as a father carried legal weight. Yvonne sat next to him, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, giving me a look of pure maternal disappointment. They genuinely believed that because they were my parents, the judge would look at the situation, scold me for being a disrespectful daughter, and order me to let them stay in the house. They thought the justice system was just an extension of their church deacon board. Chloe and Trent sat on the other side of the table, and their appearance had been drastically altered for the occasion. Gone were the expensive clothes and the arrogant tech founder aesthetic. Trent was wearing a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt that made him look like a humble, struggling working man. Chloe wore minimal makeup and a modest sweater, trying to project the image of a stressed, vulnerable young wife. Next to them sat their legal representation. He was a disheveled man in a cheap brown suit who kept dropping his pens and shuffling nervously through a disorganized stack of loose papers. It was painfully obvious that Reginald had hired the cheapest attorney he could find, probably off a billboard on the side of the highway. Desmond and I took our seats at the defense table. I did not wave. I did not acknowledge them. I simply sat down, folded my hands in front of me, and waited. The bailiff called the room to order, and the presiding judge walked in, taking her seat at the high bench. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She adjusted her glasses, looked down at the case file, and asked the plaintiff's attorney to present his argument for the emergency injunction. The cheap lawyer stood up, clearing his throat nervously. "Your Honor," he began, his voice lacking any real confidence. "We filed this injunction to stop what is fundamentally an illegal and retaliatory eviction. My clients, Reginald and Yvonne, are the parents of the defendant. They have lived in this residence for decades. We argue that there is an implied lifetime tenancy based on familial bonds and oral agreements made when the defendant was just a child." I had to suppress a laugh. He was basically arguing that because Yvonne gave birth to me, I was legally obligated to house them for the rest of their natural lives, regardless of their behavior. It was an argument based entirely on emotional manipulation, and it held absolutely zero weight in a property dispute. The judge frowned, looking over her reading glasses. "Counselor, implied lifetime tenancy is an incredibly high legal bar to clear," she stated flatly. "Does your client have any written lease agreement, any proof of equity, or any document granting them permanent residence?" The lawyer stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Well, Your Honor, it is a family home. Formal contracts are rarely drawn up between parents and children. But we also have another crucial element to consider. He gestured toward Trent, who immediately slouched his shoulders to look more pathetic. My client's son-in-law, Trent, has established legal residency at the property, the lawyer continued. Under state guidelines regarding tenant rights and squatters' rights, we argue that he and his wife, Chloe, cannot be subjected to a 72-hour emergency eviction. Trent has been residing at the property and has invested significant sweat equity into the home by maintaining the premises and utilizing a portion of it for his startup business. He has a reasonable expectation of 30 to 60 days' notice before any removal can occur. It was a masterclass in aggressive victimhood. Trent was trying to use the very laws designed to protect vulnerable tenants to steal my property. He was claiming squatters' rights on a house he had illegally broken into just days prior. He sat there looking up at the judge with wide, innocent eyes, playing the role of the bullied entrepreneur whose evil sister-in-law was trying to destroy his dreams. Yvonne nodded vigorously along with the lawyer's words. She leaned over and whispered loudly to Reginald, telling him that the judge was definitely listening to them now. Reginald crossed his arms, looking incredibly smug. He shot a triumphant glare in my direction, clearly thinking that the mention of Trent's imaginary sweat equity and tenant rights had checkmated my entire case. The judge took a few notes, her face completely impassive. She looked at Trent and asked him a direct question. Sir, you claim you have established residency and invested in the property. Did you have the permission of the legal title holder to change the locks and alter the property for your business? Trent stood up, putting his hand over his heart in a gesture of fake sincerity. Your Honor, I was operating under the full authority of Reginald and Yvonne, who have always acted as the heads of the household. Maya, my sister-in-law, has always been distant and difficult. We just wanted to create a productive family environment. I even offered to compensate her once my business received its funding, but she reacted with extreme hostility and tried to throw us on the street without warning. He was lying through his teeth directly to a sworn judge. He was trying to paint me as the unstable, aggressive party while portraying his illegal lockout as a simple family misunderstanding. He thought he was so incredibly smart. He thought his smooth-talking tech founder persona could manipulate the legal system just like he manipulated my parents. The judge finished writing her note and set her pen down. She looked over at our table. Does the defense have a response to these claims? She asked, her tone indicating she was already losing patience with the plaintiff's dramatic narrative. Honor, Desmond said, his voice ringing with honor. Desmond said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. We not only contest every single claim made by the plaintiffs, but we also have the documentation to prove that this injunction is a fraudulent attempt to delay the consequences of a criminal act. The plaintiffs did not make a simple mistake. They executed a premeditated, malicious lockout to defraud my client, and they are lying to this court about their financial standing, their right to the property, and their supposed business ventures. Reginald's smug smile instantly vanished. Yvonne's grip on her purse tightened until her knuckles turned white. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the confident facade beginning to crack at the edges. They had spent the last 30 minutes building a beautiful, fragile house of cards out of lies and emotional manipulation. They were entirely unprepared for the hurricane of undeniable facts we were about to unleash on them. Desmond walked out from behind the defense table, carrying the thick black leather binder. The sound of his polished shoes echoed loudly in the completely silent courtroom. He approached the judge's bench and placed the binder down, opening it with a sharp, authoritative snap. Your Honor. Desmond began handing a stack of certified documents to the bailiff to pass up to the judge. The plaintiffs have painted a beautiful picture of a loving family home and a generous father helping his entrepreneurial son-in-law. However, the reality is that Reginald and Yvonne have not owned this property for 5 years. They are not the heads of the household. They are charity cases who are living under my client's roof entirely by her grace. The judge took the documents and adjusted her glasses. Reginald shifted violently in his seat, opening his mouth to object, but his cheap lawyer quickly grabbed his arm and pulled him down, whispering frantically for him to stay quiet. Desmond turned to face the courtroom, his voice projecting with absolute clarity. 5 years ago, Reginald accumulated a massive amount of undisclosed gambling debts. He drained his retirement accounts and took out secondary mortgages that he could not afford to repay. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. Reginald and Yvonne were exactly 3 weeks away from being completely homeless. They had absolutely zero equity left in the property. I watched my father's face crumble. The proud church deacon who loved to stand at the pulpit and lecture other men about financial responsibility was being exposed in a public courtroom. Yvonne covered her face with her hands, the shame finally breaking through her deep delusions. They had spent years pretending they were wealthy socialites, and now the entire room knew they were bankrupt gamblers. My client Maya is a senior real estate auditor, Desmond continued. She did not give her father a small personal loan, as he just falsely claimed to this court. She took $150,000 of her own personal savings and purchased the property outright from the bank in a cash sale to stop the foreclosure. Desmond handed another heavy document to the bailiff. This is the certified county deed, Your Honor. You will see that Maya is the sole legal owner with 100% equity. Reginald and Yvonne signed away all rights to the property 5 years ago. There is no implied lifetime tenancy. There was only a daughter who took pity on her financially reckless parents and allowed them to stay in the spare bedrooms so they would not have to sleep in a homeless shelter. The cheap strip mall attorney representing my family leaned over his table to look at the copy of the deed Desmond had provided. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. He realized in that exact moment that his clients had lied to him about everything. He had just filed an emergency injunction and argued tenant rights based entirely on the word of a man who did not own a single brick of the house. But Desmond was not finished. He reached back into his binder and pulled out a thick stack of bank statements, highlighting specific lines with a bright yellow marker. Furthermore, Your Honor, the plaintiffs have claimed that they allowed my client to live there as a tenant, paying $1,000 a month in rent. This is another blatant lie. Desmond handed the bank statements to the bailiff. These are my client's financial records for the past 5 years. Every single month, Maya transferred exactly $1,000 into Reginald's checking account. It was not rent. It was a charitable stipend she provided to her parents because they could not even afford to buy groceries or pay the electric bill for the house she bought for them. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling. The judge looked through the bank statements, her expression turning into a mask of pure judicial disgust. She looked down at Reginald and Yvonne as if they were insects. "Let me get this completely straight," the judge said, her voice sharp and dangerous. "You lost your home due to gambling debts. Your daughter spent her life savings to buy the house so you would not be on the street. She gave you money every month to survive. And your response was to change the locks on her doors, throw her belongings into the rain, and claim the house was yours." Reginald opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish out of water, gasping for air. He looked back at me, his eyes silently pleading for me to stop the presentation, but I just stared back at him with absolute zero sympathy. Yvonne was silently weeping, her tears ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her silk blouse. Desmond turned his attention toward Trent, who was desperately trying to shrink down into his chair and become invisible. As for the son-in-law, Desmond said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Trent claims he has established residency and sweat equity. He claims he had the permission of the homeowners to alter the property for his business. Your Honor, the only legal homeowner is Maya. She never gave Trent permission to live in her house. She never gave him permission to run a business out of her guest room. Reginald and Yvonne had absolutely no legal authority to invite him to live there, let alone authorize him to dismantle my client's personal sanctuary." Desmond walked back to the defense table and picked up the police incident report from Tuesday night, holding it up for the court to see. Trent is not a legal tenant, Desmond declared. He is an unauthorized squatter who conspired with my client's parents to execute an illegal lockout. They deliberately destroyed thousands of dollars of my client's personal property, which is thoroughly documented in this police report. They did this specifically so Trent could attempt to use my client's property as collateral for a fraudulent business loan. They came to this court today hoping to use tenant protection laws to shield themselves from the consequences of their own malicious criminal actions. The judge set the paperwork down on her desk and folded her hands tightly together. She did not look at the plaintiff's attorney. She looked directly at Reginald. "Sir," the judge said, her tone incredibly cold and unforgiving. "You have come into my courtroom and committed perjury. You have attempted to weaponize the legal system against the very person who saved you from financial ruin. Your attorney filed a frivolous injunction based on your deliberate lies." The cheap lawyer immediately stood up, throwing his hands in the air. "Your Honor, I would like to state for the public record that I was not aware of the true ownership of the property. My clients explicitly assured me they held the deed. They provided me with fraudulent information. I withdraw my support for this injunction immediately." He was abandoning them right there on the spot. He knew the judge was about to drop the hammer, and he was desperately trying to save his own legal license. Reginald reached out and grabbed his lawyer's sleeve, panic completely taking over his face. "You cannot do this!" Reginald hissed loudly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You work for me. You have to fix this right now." The lawyer yanked his arm away and stepped back from the table, leaving my family completely isolated. Chloe was staring at Trent with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that her successful husband had no backup plan and no actual power. Trent was staring at the floor, his alpha male persona completely shattered by the undeniable weight of financial receipts. He was just a broke man, wearing a wrinkled shirt, and the entire court knew it. I sat perfectly still, my posture straight, and my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the absolute destruction of their false reality. They had spent my entire life treating me like a second-class citizen in my own family. They had demanded respect while offering nothing but cruelty. They had worshipped a white man with no job simply because he used big words, while they treated their successful black daughter like an automated teller machine. Now the entire world knew exactly who they were. The curtain had been pulled back, and the ugly, pathetic truth was completely exposed for the court to see. Desmond took his seat next to me, closing his thick black binder with a final satisfying thud. The financial records had done exactly what they were supposed to do. The bomb had been dropped, and there was absolutely nothing left of their defense but smoke and ash. We had completely dismantled their lies, their arrogance, and their fake empire in less than 15 minutes. Now all that was left was for the judge to deliver the final fatal blow. The judge reached for her wooden gavel, fully prepared to dismiss the ridiculous injunction and finalize the eviction. My parents were sitting in stunned silence. Their lawyer had completely abandoned them, and the reality of their homelessness was finally sinking in. But I was not finished. I placed my hand gently on Desmond's sleeve, stopping him from sitting down. We had proven my ownership of the house, but I was not going to let my family walk out of this courtroom believing that Trent was just an innocent victim of a misunderstanding. I wanted to completely eradicate the fake golden pedestal they had placed him on. Desmond gave me a subtle nod. He remained standing and turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor," Desmond said, his voice steady and commanding. "Before you issue your final ruling regarding the eviction, we have a legal and ethical obligation to bring one more matter to the attention of this court. The plaintiffs submitted a loan application as part of their emergency injunction filing, attempting to prove their financial stability. My client is a senior real estate auditor and a forensic financial investigator. When she reviewed the documents they submitted, she discovered an active predatory financial scheme occurring within her own property." The judge slowly lowered her gavel, her sharp eyes narrowing. "A financial scheme," she repeated, looking over at Trent, who suddenly looked like he was going to be sick. Proceed, counselor. Desmond reached into his leather binder and pulled out a fresh stack of documents. He handed copies to the bailiff to pass to the judge. The plaintiff's son-in-law, Trent, has claimed under oath today that he is an entrepreneur building a technology startup, Desmond began. He used this claim to justify his illegal residency and to pressure his elderly in-laws into kicking my client out of her own home. He convinced Reginald and Yvonne to apply for a $200,000 home equity line of credit using my client's property as collateral. Trent told them this money was needed to secure servers and hire a marketing team. Desmond paused, letting the sheer audacity of the lie hang in the quiet courtroom. Your Honor, there is no technology startup, Desmond stated clearly. My client ran a comprehensive search of state and federal business registries. Trent does not own a limited liability company. He does not hold a business license. He does not even own a registered website domain. The company he has been bragging about to his family and to his social media followers is a complete fabrication. Chloe let out a sharp gasp. She turned to look at her husband, her eyes wide with confusion. Trent, what is he talking about? She whispered frantically. Trent did not look at her. He was staring straight ahead, his face completely pale, sweat beading on his forehead. But it gets much worse. Desmond continued, his voice growing louder and more forceful. When my client examined the loan pre-approval documents Reginald submitted, she noticed the intended destination account for the $200,000 payout. It was not a joint family account. It was not a business account. It was a private offshore checking account registered entirely in Trent's name. Chloe was not listed on it. Reginald and Yvonne were not listed on it. Reginald sat straight up in his chair, his eyes darting between Desmond and the judge. He was finally starting to understand the massive trap he had willingly walked into. Desmond pulled out another printed report. My client also conducted a routine background check on the man attempting to use her property for a massive loan. Trent currently has over $80,000 in unsecured credit card debt. He has 3 separate accounts in collections. Furthermore, his financial footprint shows massive daily transfers to unregulated offshore sports betting and cryptocurrency platforms. Trent is not an entrepreneur. He is an unemployed man with a severe gambling addiction who is completely drowning in debt. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of Yvonne's ragged breathing echoed off the wood-paneled walls. The illusion of the perfect white son-in-law was being brutally dissected right in front of them. The man they had chosen over their own daughter was nothing but a broke, desperate scammer. Desmond delivered the final, devastating blow. The entire purpose of the illegal lockout was fraud, Your Honor. Trent knew he had absolutely no income and terrible credit. He knew the bank would never give him a loan. So he manipulated his arrogant, financially illiterate in-laws into kicking my client out. His plan was to rush them into signing the loan paperwork, falsely claiming they had full equity in the house. The moment the bank deposited that $200,000 into his private account, Trent was going to take the money and vanish to pay off his gambling debts. Desmond pointed directly at my father. He was going to leave Reginald and Yvonne holding a massive, fraudulent loan tied to a house they did not even own. When they inevitably defaulted on the payments, the bank would have pressed criminal fraud charges against them. Trent was not trying to elevate this family to a new tax bracket. He was actively setting them up to die in a federal prison while he ran off with their money. The reaction at the plaintiff's table was instantaneous and completely explosive. Chloe let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She stood up so fast her chair fell backward, hitting the floor with a loud crack. She grabbed Trent by the collar of his wrinkled shirt, shaking him violently. "Tell me he is lying," Chloe screamed, her perfect golden child facade completely shattering into pieces. "Tell me you did not try to steal money and leave me. Where is the startup, Trent? Where is the money?" Trent tried to push her hands away, looking around the courtroom in absolute panic. "Chloe, calm down," he stammered, his voice shaking. "You do not understand. I just needed some capital to get back on my feet. I had a bad run with the crypto market, but I was going to win it all back. I swear I was going to take care of you. He had just confessed. Right there in front of the judge, the bailiff, and the family he had tried to destroy. He had admitted that the business was a lie and the debt was real. Reginald lunged across the table, grabbing Trent by the shoulder of his jacket. The old man was shaking with an absolute murderous rage. "You worthless piece of garbage!" Reginald roared, spittle flying from his lips. "I threw my own daughter out into the freezing rain for you. I let you sleep in her bed. I lied to the police for you. And you were going to leave me to rot in jail." Yvonne was openly weeping now, burying her face in her hands. The deep, heavy sobs of a woman who finally realized that she had traded her only loyal child for a parasite. She had worshipped the ground Trent walked on simply because he spoke with unearned confidence and fit the aesthetic she wanted for her country club image. Now she realized that her own superficial vanity had nearly cost her her freedom and her life. Bailiff the judge shouted, banging her gavel heavily on the wooden block. "Restore order in this courtroom right now!" The two armed deputies moved forward, quickly separating Reginald from Trent. They forced my father back into his chair and instructed Trent to sit down and stop talking. The chaos subsided into heavy, strained breathing and the sound of Chloe's continuous hysterical crying. I sat at the defense table perfectly still. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. Reginald and Yvonne were only angry because they were the ones getting scammed. If Trent really had been a millionaire, they would have happily let me sleep on the street. They were not mourning the loss of their relationship with me. They were mourning the loss of their imaginary wealth and their shattered egos. The judge looked down at the plaintiff's table with an expression of absolute disgust. She had seen countless property disputes, but the sheer level of manipulation and familial betrayal displayed in her courtroom today clearly repulsed her. She picked up her pen and began signing the documents in front of her. "This court finds the emergency injunction filed by the plaintiffs to be entirely without merit," the judge stated, her voice echoing with final authority. "Furthermore, based on the evidence of fraudulent loan applications and premeditated property destruction, I am referring the transcript of this hearing to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation into Trent and Reginald." Reginald buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, groaning sound. He had come to court trying to steal my house, and now he was leaving with a potential criminal investigation hanging over his head. "The 72-hour notice stands," the judge declared, looking directly at my parents. "You will vacate the property immediately. If you or your son-in-law attempt to remove a single appliance, a single light fixture, or cause any damage to the walls of that house on your way out, you will be arrested for felony property destruction before the sun goes down." The judge banged her gavel one final time. "This case is dismissed." The sound of the wooden mallet hitting the block was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of my complete and total liberation. The chains of family obligation, the years of being told I was not good enough, the endless monthly payments to fund their reckless lifestyle, all of it was instantly severed. Desmond closed his binder and gave me a respectful nod. He knew exactly what this moment meant to me. I stood up from the defense table, smoothing out the front of my tailored suit jacket. I picked up my leather bag and turned to walk down the center aisle of the courtroom. "Maya, wait." The desperate, raspy voice belonged to my mother. I stopped and turned my head slightly. Yvonne was rushing toward me, tears streaming down her face, her hands reaching out as if she wanted to hug me. Reginald was right behind her, looking like a broken, defeated old man. "Maya, please," Yvonne sobbed, grabbing onto my sleeve. "You have to help us. You saved us from him. You proved he was a scammer. We are so sorry. We did not know what Trent was doing. We are your parents, Maya. You cannot let us sleep on the street. Please let us come back home. We will kick Chloe and Trent out. It will just be us again." I looked down at her hands gripping my expensive suit. Then I looked into her eyes. They were wide with genuine fear. The arrogant, demanding mother who had met me at the cafe just a few days ago was completely gone. In her place was a terrified woman who realized she had absolutely nothing left. I reached down and calmly peeled her fingers off my jacket. "You changed the locks, Yvonne." I said, my voice quiet but carrying the cold, heavy weight of absolute finality. You told me to go live on my own, so I did. But we have no money, Reginald pleaded, his voice cracking. The church will completely disown us when they find out about this. We have nowhere to go. I looked at my father, the man who had thrown my favorite shoes into a muddy puddle, and smiled while doing it. I tilted my head slightly. Then I suggest you go find a good cardboard box, Reginald, I replied completely deadpan, because it is supposed to rain again tonight. I turned my back on them and walked out of the courtroom through the heavy oak doors. I stepped out into the bright Atlanta afternoon, the cool air hitting my face. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet, intoxicating air of pure, unadulterated freedom. My house was finally mine. My life was finally mine. And the garbage was finally taking itself out. I stood on the wide concrete steps of the Fulton County Courthouse, letting the cool autumn breeze wash over me. The heavy oak doors swung open behind me, and Desmond stepped out into the sunlight. He was holding his thick black leather binder, but this time a deeply satisfied smile played across his face. He walked up to me and handed me a freshly stamped document from the clerk. He told me that right after I turned my back and walked out of the courtroom, the judge had one final piece of business to conclude. Because my parents and Trent had submitted a fraudulent loan application and committed perjury, the judge completely revoked the remainder of their 72-hour notice. They were no longer allowed to return to the property unsupervised. The judge ordered a mandatory civil standby, meaning armed deputies would escort them back to the house immediately and give them exactly 1 hour to pack whatever they could fit into their cars. After that, the locks would remain permanently sealed. But that was not all, Desmond said, tapping the bottom paragraph of the document. The judge also reviewed the police incident report and the photographs of your ruined belongings. She approved our emergency motion for civil damages on the spot. Reginald and Yvonne are officially ordered to pay you $15,000 in restitution for the custom clothing, the designer leather bags, and the corporate electronics they threw into the mud. If they do not pay it within 30 days, the court will place a permanent lien on any future wages or Social Security benefits they receive. I looked down at the paper, reading the bold print. $15,000. It was the exact amount they had tried to squeeze out of me over the years in emotional tax. It was a perfectly poetic number. Before I could say anything, the heavy courthouse doors burst open again. 2 armed bailiffs were forcefully escorting my family out of the building. The scene unfolding in front of me was a portrait of absolute devastation. Chloe was the first one through the doors, and she was completely unrecognizable. The perfect golden child facade had entirely melted away. Her face was red and streaked with tears, her hair was a mess, and she was hyperventilating. The moment her expensive shoes hit the concrete steps, her knees actually buckled. She collapsed right there on the hard ground, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked up at Trent, who was walking out right behind her. He had his head down, his shoulders hunched, looking like a beaten dog. Chloe grabbed the fabric of his trousers, screaming at him at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know where the money was. She demanded to know how he could lie to her about the startup, the offshore accounts, and the $80,000 in credit card debt. She yelled that she had married a visionary, and instead she was tied to a broke gambling addict who had just made her homeless. Trent did not try to comfort her. He did not offer any more tech buzzwords or alpha male motivational quotes. He simply yanked his leg away from her grip, his face pale and twisted with cowardice. He muttered something about needing to make a phone call, and without looking back at his sobbing wife, he practically sprinted down the courthouse steps, heading toward the street. He was abandoning her. The moment the money and the free housing evaporated, Trent did exactly what parasites do. He detached himself and ran away to find a new host. Chloe screamed his name, but he did not stop. She buried her face in her hands, wailing loudly, as pedestrians and lawyers walking by stopped to stare at the public spectacle. Reginald and Yvonne walked out last, and they looked like they were dead on their feet. The blood had completely drained from their faces, leaving them looking gray and hollow. They moved with the slow, stiff gait of people walking to their own execution. The absolute reality of their situation had finally crushed the last remaining ounces of their arrogance. They saw me standing near the bottom of the steps holding the court order. Reginald could not even meet my eyes. He stared blankly at the concrete, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He was a man who had spent his entire life demanding respect and obedience from everyone around him. He had built his identity on the illusion of control and financial dominance. Now he was a public fraud about to be escorted by police to collect his clothes in garbage bags. He was completely broken. Yvonne looked at Chloe crying on the ground and then looked at me. Her eyes were vacant, practically glassy with shock. She slowly walked down the steps until she was standing just a few feet away from me. "Maya," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly I could barely hear her. "The judge said we owe you $15,000. We do not have $15,000. We do not even have enough money for a hotel room tonight. How are we supposed to survive?" I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. I thought about all the times she had belittled my accomplishments to praise Chloe's basic existence. I thought about the text message she sent me telling me to get my trash off the lawn. I thought about her sitting in the cafe drinking sparkling water while demanding I sign away my only financial security. "You will have to figure that out, Yvonne," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of sympathy. "Maybe you can apply for a credit card. Or maybe you can ask your church friends for a loan. Be sure to tell them exactly why you need the money." She flinched as if I had physically struck her. The mention of her church friends was the final twist of the knife. She knew that by tomorrow morning, everyone in her social circle would know that she and Reginald were broke scammers who had tried to steal their own daughter's house. She would be completely ostracized from the only community she cared about. The social death would hurt her far more than the financial ruin. "You are going to take the money from our social security?" Yvonne asked, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "You are really going to leave us with nothing?" "You left yourselves with nothing," I replied, taking a step back from her. "I gave you a fully paid-off roof over your heads. I gave you an allowance. All you had to do was leave me alone. But your greed and your obsession with a mediocre white man destroyed the best thing you ever had." I turned to Desmond, who was standing quietly beside me, watching the exchange with professional detachment. "Thank you, Desmond," I said, extending my hand. "I will see you at the office tomorrow to finalize the paperwork." Desmond shook my hand warmly. "Enjoy your house, Maya. It is officially yours again." I turned my back on my parents and my sister. I walked down the remaining concrete steps and out onto the bustling Atlanta sidewalk. I did not look over my shoulder, even as Chloe's hysterical sobbing echoed behind me. I walked straight to my car, unlocked the doors, and slid into the driver's seat. I sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the engine. The storm was finally over. The toxic infection that had plagued my life for 35 years had been completely surgically removed. They were going to spend the rest of the day packing their belongings under the watchful eyes of armed police officers. They were going to spend the next several years drowning in debt, trying to pay off the $15,000 restitution they owed me. And Trent was likely already halfway across the city, running from his own financial disasters. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the traffic. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glass skyscrapers of the city. I was heading back to my beautiful colonial home, the one I had bought with my own hard-earned money. I was going to call a contractor to fix the damaged doorframe. I was going to buy brand new designer clothes to replace the ones they ruined. I was going to sleep in my own bed knowing that no one would ever have the power to lock me out again. The cost of my freedom had been steep, but as I drove toward my future, I knew it was worth every single penny. I pulled my car into the driveway of my property and parked right behind the two Fulton County Sheriff cruisers. The heavy rain from the past few days had finally cleared, leaving the Atlanta suburbs bathed in bright, unforgiving afternoon sunlight. It was the kind of light that illuminated every single flaw and left absolutely nowhere to hide. I stepped out of my vehicle wearing my tailored suit carrying my leather tote bag and walked up the concrete path. The same path where my ruined belongings had been scattered just days prior. The lead deputy, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely stern expression, walked down the porch steps to meet me. He informed me that the civil standby was ready to commence. He explained the parameters clearly. My family would be given exactly 60 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings they could physically carry. There would be no moving trucks allowed. There would be no heavy furniture removal. Once the 60-minute timer expired, anyone still inside the house would be arrested for criminal trespassing, and anything left behind would legally become abandoned property. I checked the sleek silver watch on my wrist and gave the deputy a firm nod. I told him I understood the parameters perfectly. Less than 10 minutes later, a silver sedan slowly turned onto the street and pulled up to the curb. It was Reginald's car. The engine sputtered slightly, sounding just as exhausted and broken as the people sitting inside it. The doors opened, and my family stepped out onto the asphalt. There were only 3 of them: Reginald, Yvonne, and Chloe. Trent was nowhere to be found. Just as I had predicted, the so-called alpha male visionary had taken one look at the massive financial and legal disaster he had caused and ran for the hills. He had completely abandoned his wife, leaving her to face the humiliation and the homelessness entirely on her own. Chloe looked like an absolute ghost. Her face was completely devoid of makeup, her eyes were swollen shut from hours of hysterical crying, and her hands were visibly shaking as she closed the car door. Reginald and Yvonne moved with the slow, stiff posture of the defeated. They walked up the driveway toward the front porch, keeping their heads down, unable to make eye contact with the armed deputies or with me. The lead deputy stepped forward and blocked their path to the door. He recited the rules of the civil standby in a loud, authoritative voice, ensuring the neighbors could hear every single word. He told them they had exactly 1 hour. Reginald cleared his throat, trying to summon a tiny fraction of his old patriarchal authority. He asked the deputy if he could access the garage to grab some heavy-duty moving boxes. The deputy shook his head. He pointed to a large commercial roll of heavy-duty black plastic contractor bags resting on the edge of the porch. I had purchased them on my way over. They were the exact same brand, the exact same size, and the exact same color as the bags they had used to throw my custom suits into the mud. "You have 60 minutes, the deputy said, pointing at the roll. "Use the bags. Your time starts right now." I watched the realization wash over Yvonne's face. She looked at the black plastic bags, and then she looked at me. The poetic justice was so thick and heavy, you could practically choke on it. They were going to leave this house the exact same way they had tried to force me out. Like garbage. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. I stepped inside the foyer, leaning my back against the wall and crossing my arms over my chest. The deputies escorted them inside, and the absolute panic immediately set in. They had 30 years of accumulated life in this house. 30 years of expensive clothes, antique knickknacks, and hoarded memories. Now they had 60 minutes to decide what was actually worth saving. Yvonne ran straight toward the formal dining room. I watched from the hallway as her trembling hands started grabbing her expensive imported china plates. She tried to wrap them in cloth napkins before shoving them frantically into the black plastic bags. The sound of expensive porcelain clanking against each other echoed through the house. Reginald rushed into his home office, pulling open filing cabinets and frantically dumping loose paperwork, tax returns, and old photographs into his own garbage bag. 20 minutes into the countdown, a white utility van pulled into the driveway, parking behind the police cruisers. It was the professional locksmith I had hired on my drive over from the courthouse. He walked up the front steps carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. I directed him to the front door and instructed him to completely remove the cheap deadbolt Trent had installed. I had ordered a top-of-the-line biometric fingerprint locking system. It was a heavy piece of matte black steel that required a registered thumbprint to engage the mechanism. As my parents frantically ran through the house, tearing their lives apart, The loud piercing sound of the locksmith's power drill echoed through the hallways. It was a constant loud mechanical reminder that their control over this property was being permanently eradicated. I walked up the main staircase to supervise the second floor. I strolled down the hallway and stood in the doorway of my old bedroom, the room Chloe and Trent had claimed for their non-existent empire. Chloe was on her knees in front of the open closet. She was blindly pulling expensive designer dresses, silk blouses, and cashmere sweaters off their wooden hangers and stuffing them into a black trash bag. She was not folding anything. She was just crushing the delicate fabrics together, weeping loudly as she worked. She paused for a second and looked up at me standing in the doorway. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, absolute misery. "How can you do this?" Maya, Chloe sobbed, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "How can you just stand there and watch your own flesh and blood suffer? I do not even know where my husband is. I have nowhere to go. You are a monster." I did not raise my voice. I did not move from the doorframe. I simply looked at the wet, crumpled silk dress in her hands. "You stood at that exact window 3 days ago, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly flat and cold. "You wore my sweater. You drank coffee. And you laughed while my life was thrown into the freezing rain. You played stupid games and now you are winning your stupid prize. You have exactly 25 minutes left. I suggest you pack faster." I turned around and walked back downstairs, leaving her to choke on her own tears. The final 30 minutes were a blur of absolute chaotic desperation. Reginald tried to carry a heavy antique clock down the stairs, but the deputy ordered him to leave it behind, stating it was too large and not a personal necessity. Yvonne realized she could not fit her massive collection of designer shoes into the bags, so she started layering them, wearing 3 different coats and trying to stuff shoes into the deep pockets. They looked completely ridiculous. They looked like looters scrambling through a sinking ship. Suddenly, the sharp, shrill sound of the deputy's whistle pierced the air. "Time is up," the deputy shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Drop whatever you are doing. Take the bags you have packed and proceed to the front door immediately." Yvonne let out a loud wail, begging for just 5 more minutes to get into the jewelry box in the master bedroom. The deputy did not care. He put his hand on his duty belt and pointed toward the exit. The strictness of the law, which they had tried to weaponize against me, was now pushing them out the door. The visual of my arrogant family dragging heavy black garbage bags across the pristine hardwood floors was an absolute masterpiece. Reginald was sweating profusely, his face red from the physical exertion of dragging a 50-pound bag of loose papers. Yvonne was hobbling in her layers of coats, dragging 2 bags of clothes that were scraping loudly against the floorboards. Chloe followed behind them, clutching a single bag to her chest, looking completely broken. They dragged their garbage bags out the front door and began the humiliating walk down the porch steps and toward their car. By this time, the commotion had attracted a significant audience. This was a quiet, upscale neighborhood, and the presence of 2 police cruisers and a utility van had drawn people out of their houses. I stepped out onto the porch and watched as several of my neighbors, the exact same people Yvonne loved to impress at the neighborhood association meetings, stood on their lawns watching the spectacle. Mrs. Higgins, the biggest gossip in the entire subdivision, was standing at the edge of her driveway, with her phone out blatantly recording the scene. Yvonne tried to hide her face, turning her head away and using one of the black garbage bags as a shield, but it was entirely useless. The entire neighborhood was watching the great Reginald and Yvonne being forcefully evicted by armed guards dragging trash bags across the grass. It was the ultimate social death for a woman who valued appearances more than her own children. They reached the silver sedan and began hoisting the heavy bags into the trunk. They piled them in until the trunk was overflowing, forcing them to tie it down with a piece of bungee cord. They shoved the remaining bags into the back seat. Chloe had to climb into the back and sit with her knees pressed against her chest, a black plastic bag full of shoes resting heavily on her lap. Reginald walked around to the driver's side. He looked old. He looked completely defeated. He opened the door and slumped into the seat, resting his head against the steering wheel. Yvonne stood by the open passenger door. She stopped and turned around, looking back at the house. She looked at the manicured lawn, the beautiful brick exterior, and the wide, welcoming porch. Then she looked at me. The locksmith had just finished his work. He packed up his drill, wiped down the sleek black glass of the new fingerprint scanner, and handed me the final invoice. I thanked him, and he walked past Yvonne, getting into his van and driving away. Yvonne stood there, her eyes welling with fresh tears. She opened her mouth, taking a slight step forward. I knew exactly what she wanted to do. She wanted to offer one last pathetic apology. She wanted to throw herself on my mercy and beg me to let them back inside now that the reality of sleeping in that cramped sedan had finally hit her. I did not give her the chance to speak a single syllable. I stepped back into the doorway and reached out to the heavy wooden door. I pulled it shut, stopping just an inch before the frame. I looked directly into Yvonne's eyes, holding her gaze with absolute, unwavering dominance. I pressed my right thumb against the biometric scanner. The machine emitted a soft green glow, reading my unique print. A pleasant mechanical chime echoed through the quiet afternoon air, followed immediately by the heavy solid click of the steel deadbolt sliding permanently into place. I did not smile. I did not wave goodbye. I simply let the door close completely, shutting them out of my life forever. I turned around and walked deep into the quiet sanctuary of my completely empty, perfectly silent house. The first few weeks, living alone in my house, felt like breathing pure oxygen after spending 35 years slowly suffocating underwater. I hired a premium contracting team to completely repair the damage my family had done to the door frames and the hardwood floors. I replaced every single ruined silk blouse and designer shoe using the corporate bonus I received at the end of the quarter. My home was a sanctuary again, perfectly quiet, perfectly clean, and completely mine. But while I was enjoying the peace of my restored kingdom, the fake empire my family had tried to build was collapsing into absolute ruins. It did not take long for the inevitable implosion to happen. According to the updates I received from Desmond, who was legally monitoring their financial situation to collect my $15,000 court judgment, the reality of their homelessness broke them apart in less than 72 hours. After I locked them out of the house, Reginald, Yvonne, Chloe, and Trent had been forced to cram themselves into a single room at a cheap roadside motel off the interstate. It was the only place that would take them without a background check or a massive security deposit. The tension in that tiny room must have been incredibly toxic. Trent lasted exactly 3 days in the real world. The man who constantly bragged about his alpha male mindset and his visionary resilience proved to be the ultimate coward. On their third night in the motel, Trent waited until Chloe, Reginald, and Yvonne were fast asleep. He quietly packed his clothes into a duffel bag. He sneaked over to Reginald's coat and completely emptied my father's wallet, taking the last $300 my parents had to their name. He did not leave a note. He did not say goodbye. He just slipped out the door into the dark night and completely vanished. Chloe woke up the next morning to find her husband gone and her entire life completely destroyed. She tried to call him, but the number was disconnected. He had abandoned her the second she was no longer useful to him. But Trent did not just leave her with a broken heart. Because they were legally married and had shared financial accounts, Trent's massive mountain of debt suddenly became Chloe's primary problem. The creditors who had been hunting him down immediately turned their attention to her. My sister, the beautiful golden child, who had never worked a hard day in her life, was suddenly fielding daily calls from aggressive debt collectors. She had no college degree, no work experience, and a completely ruined credit score. Within a week, the reality of survival forced her to do the one thing she thought she was too good for. Chloe had to swallow her pride and take a minimum wage job folding clothes at a retail store in a strip mall just to afford cheap takeout food. Without Trent's delusions to keep them going, and with their last few dollars stolen, Reginald and Yvonne were forced to face their own devastating reality. The motel was too expensive to maintain on Reginald's meager Social Security checks, especially since Desmond had already successfully filed the paperwork to garnish a portion of those checks to pay off my $15,000 restitution. By the end of the second week, my parents were evicted from the motel. With absolutely no savings and a terrible rental history, they had only one option left. They signed a lease for a dilapidated single-wide trailer in a rundown park 40 miles outside of the city limits. The contrast was absolute poetic justice. They had gone from living rent-free in a massive colonial brick home with a manicured lawn to living in a rusting metal box surrounded by dirt and gravel. The trailer had peeling linoleum floors, a leaking roof, and a constantly malfunctioning heater. Yvonne, who used to complain if the air conditioning in my house was 1 degree too warm, was now sleeping in a cramped bedroom with a drafty window. But the physical downgrade was nothing compared to the complete and total social death they experienced. Yvonne had spent decades building her identity around her status at the local church and the upscale country club. She genuinely believed that if she just showed her face and acted like nothing had happened, her friends would rally around her and offer her support. So on their first Sunday, living in the trailer park, Yvonne forced Reginald to put on his only clean suit, and they drove their sputtering car all the way back to their wealthy church in Atlanta. They walked through the heavy wooden doors, expecting the usual warm greetings and respectful handshakes. Instead, they were met with an absolute freezing wall of silence. Mrs. Higgins, the neighborhood gossip, had done her job perfectly. The video of the sheriff serving the eviction notice and the public records, proving I was the sole owner of the house, had been circulated to every single member of the congregation. Everyone knew the truth. They knew Reginald had gambled away his house 5 years ago. They knew Yvonne had tried to steal my property to fund a fake tech startup. As my parents walked down the center aisle, people literally turned their backs on them. Women who used to invite Yvonne to exclusive brunch parties suddenly found the hymn books incredibly interesting. Men who used to seek Reginald's advice on the deacon board refused to make eye contact with him. Before the service even began, the senior pastor approached Reginald in the hallway. He did not raise his voice, but his words were incredibly sharp. He politely asked Reginald to formally step down from his position as a church deacon, effective immediately. The pastor stated that the church could not have a man sitting in a position of moral and financial leadership when he was currently under investigation for a fraudulent loan application and had publicly thrown his own daughter out into the street. It was the ultimate humiliation. Reginald was stripped of his title, his respect, and his pride right there in the church lobby. Yvonne burst into tears, realizing that she was no longer the queen of her social circle. She was just a broke, disgraced woman living in a trailer park. They turned around and walked out of the church, never to return again. They had lost absolutely everything: their home, their golden son-in-law, their money, and their community. The complete isolation finally broke through their thick walls of arrogance and forced them to look at the one person they had completely taken for granted: me. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 month after the rainy night they had locked me out. I was sitting on my plush living room sofa, sipping a glass of expensive red wine and reading a novel. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I picked it up and saw a long text message from a number I had not saved but instantly recognized. It was Yvonne. "Maya, please read this," the text began. "I know you are angry and you have every right to be. We made a terrible mistake. Trent manipulated us. He poisoned our minds against you, and then he abandoned us. We are living in a terrible place, Maya. The roof is leaking and the heater does not work. Your father is coughing constantly. Chloe is working double shifts just so we can eat. Please, baby, we are your family. We are so sorry. Can we please just come back? We will live in the basement. We will not bother you. Just please do not leave us out here to die." A few seconds later, another message popped up, this time from Chloe. "Maya, I am so sorry," she wrote. "You were right about Trent. You were right about everything. I was so stupid and brainwashed. Please let me come home. I miss my sister. I will pay you rent. I will clean the house. Just please answer me." I sat there in the warm, soft glow of my living room reading their desperate words. I read the apologies they should have given me years ago. I read the panic and the fear in their text messages. And I felt absolutely nothing. There was no guilt. There was no lingering sense of daughterly obligation. I did not feel the sudden urge to swoop in and save them from the consequences of their own cruel actions. They were only apologizing because they were cold and hungry. If Trent had actually gotten that $200,000 loan, they would still be living in my house, laughing at me and calling me a failure. They did not miss me. They missed my money. They missed the comfortable life I had provided for them, while they treated me like garbage. I took a slow sip of my wine, tasting the rich, complex notes of the dark grapes. I set the glass down on the table. I opened the contact settings on my phone. I tapped on Yvonne's number and pressed the red button that said block caller. I confirmed the action, watching her digital footprint vanish from my device. I did the exact same thing to Chloe's number. I went through my call log and blocked Reginald just for good measure. I did not reply to them. I did not give them the satisfaction of a sharp comeback or a gloating response. I gave them the exact same cold, absolute silence they had given me when I stood in the freezing rain, looking up at my own bedroom window. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the table. I picked up my book, found my page, and continued reading. The house was perfectly quiet, holding me in its warm, protective embrace. The people who had tried to break me were completely erased from my reality, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The scales of justice were finally perfectly balanced. I took another sip of my wine, letting the absolute silence of the house wash over me. For the first time in my entire life, I was not anticipating a crisis. I was not bracing myself for a passive-aggressive comment from my mother or a condescending remark from my sister. I did not have to listen to Trent pacing the floorboards upstairs, pretending to be on a massive business call. The house was just breathing with me, perfectly still and completely safe. There is a very dangerous concept that is heavily pushed in our society, especially within religious circles and the Black community. It is the concept of toxic forgiveness. From the time we are young, we are taught that family is everything. We are told that blood is thicker than water, and that no matter how horribly your parents or your siblings treat you, it is your moral obligation to turn the other cheek. People will tell you to be the bigger person. They will tell you that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But I am a senior auditor. I deal in facts ledgers and absolute reality. And the reality is that toxic forgiveness is not a virtue. It is a tool used by abusers to escape accountability. If I had answered Yvonne's text message tonight and told her I forgave her, she would not have learned a single lesson. She would have simply learned that she could throw me onto the street, attempt to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from me, and still have a warm bed to sleep in. If I let Chloe move into my basement, she would just wait for the next Trent to come along, and she would try to sacrifice me all over again to fund her lifestyle. Forgiving them without a fundamental change in their behavior would not be an act of grace. It would be an act of self-destruction. It would be willingly opening the vault door and inviting the bank robbers back inside to finish the job. I looked around my beautiful, spacious living room. The moonlight was streaming through the large windows, illuminating the polished hardwood floors and the expensive new furniture I had purchased to replace the things they had ruined. For 5 years I had walked around this house feeling like a guest. I had paid all the bills, covered the property taxes, and funded their groceries, yet I had always tiptoed through the hallways so I would not upset Reginald's delicate ego. I had made myself small so they could feel big. I was never going to make myself small again. Setting a boundary is not about punishing the other person. It is about protecting your own peace. When I bought this house to save them from foreclosure 5 years ago, I did it out of love and a misplaced sense of daughterly duty. I thought that saving them from ruin would finally earn me their respect. I thought Yvonne would look at me with the same pride she reserved for Chloe. I thought Reginald would finally acknowledge my hard work. Instead, my generosity only bred massive resentment. They hated the fact that I was the one who saved them. They hated the fact that the daughter they had always dismissed as the boring, unlovable spinster was the only one with the financial power to keep a roof over their heads. Trent was the perfect golden ticket for them because Trent represented a way to get rich without having to depend on me. They were so desperate to escape the shadow of my success that they completely blinded themselves to the fact that he was a con artist. They did not just betray me, they betrayed their own common sense, and they did it entirely out of spite. My phone remained silent on the coffee table, face down exactly where I left it. I knew that tomorrow they would probably try to call from a different number. I knew that Aunt Shirley or Uncle David might reach out eventually, trying to play the peacemaker, urging me to have a little compassion for two elderly people living in a drafty trailer. But my compassion was fully depleted. I had given them $150,000. I had given them $1,000 a month for 60 months. I had given them my childhood bedroom and my peace of mind. I had nothing left to give them but the consequences of their own actions. They were going to have to learn how to survive in the real world. Chloe was going to have to learn what it means to stand on her own 2 feet without a man or a wealthy sister to bail her out. Reginald and Yvonne were going to have to learn how to live within their actual means without the safety net of church prestige and country club lies. It was a harsh, brutal lesson, but it was the exact lesson they desperately needed. I stood up from the sofa, leaving my book on the cushions. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out at the front lawn. The grass had finally recovered from the heavy rain, and the deep, muddy footprints where my ruined garbage bags had been thrown. The new biometric lock on my front door gleamed softly under the porch light, a silent, steadfast guardian of my sanctuary. It is incredible how life operates sometimes. When I first saw that my key did not fit into the lock on that freezing, rainy Tuesday evening, I felt a sharp stab of panic. I felt the deep, cutting sting of ultimate rejection. But looking back, I realized that their cruelty was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. They changed the locks to strip me of my room, but they accidentally opened the door to my complete liberation. I raised my glass of wine, taking one final sip, as I looked out at the quiet, sleeping neighborhood. I had broken the cycle. I had audited my life and permanently removed the toxic liabilities. I was 35 years old, wealthy, successful, and entirely free. Family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by respect, by loyalty, and by the people who protect your peace instead of destroying it. If you have ever had to make the incredibly painful decision to cut off a toxic family member to save yourself, please let me know your story in the comments below. You are not alone, and you are not wrong for choosing your own survival. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power, setting unbreakable boundaries, and walking away from the people who never deserved you.